Fabulous, thanks. Always that slightly nervous moment when you're waiting for the slides to come up and see whether they work. So good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming to I think it's the 6th SCCS, Surrey Centre for Cybersecurity event that we've run in the last 18 months. It's nice to be in the real. We hopefully won't get too disrupted by additional audience members coming in. I'm sure we had about 120 people register, so I think there's still going to be a few trickling in. So I'm your compere for the afternoon, and we've got 4 great speakers talking about where AI meets cyber. But before we do that, I wanted to introduce the 2 organisations that pulled this together. The first is the Surrey Centre for Cybersecurity, which is head up by Professor Steve Schneider, and then Joseph, who's going to talk about the SASIG. But we'll go with Steve first. Steve's slides are on there first. So Steve, over to you.
Thanks, Andrew. So just a couple of minutes to say a few words about the Surrey Centre for Cybersecurity. So we started up this series a couple of years ago. We run these events every 3 or 4 months. We're now doing it jointly with SASIG, so you'll hear a bit about SASIG. So very nice to be back in a physical space and to have a physical audience. I must admit I'm still a bit unused to this, but it's refreshing. So looking forward to it. So just a bit about the Surrey Centre for Cybersecurity. We're one of the National Cybersecurity, National Centre for Cybersecurity recognised academic centres of excellence, both in cybersecurity research, I'd say CSR, and in cybersecurity education, Gold. So there's only 5 universities that have both of those recognitions. So we really have a lot of focus and emphasis on cybersecurity as a university, these university level recognitions. And we, as an academic unit, we focus primarily on foundations of cybersecurity, but also with a strong emphasis on their applications. So we're really interested in taking the kind of fundamental research and how it applies, how it makes progress out there. In security and privacy and areas related to that. And then also we're the centre for the kind of multidisciplinary activity across the university, the Surrey Security Network. And then we also provide things like doctoral training, future connected technologies and so on. So we have quite a strong doctoral training programme. And we have a master's programme, Information Security Masters, which is GCHQ accredited. So we have the full range of education and training. And then, with particular relevance to today's topic, there's close relationship with the Surrey Institute for People-Centred AI. So that's an institute within the university that's very, very strong, and again, pan-university around AI, and we'll be seeing some aspects of the relationship between cybersecurity and AI. So that's why it's a very topical topic. And of course, we have a lot of external engagement and relationship with industry, and including in projects, we have a number of international collaborations. And just last week, I'll say something about research excellence. So those of you that may have heard about the research excellence framework that announced its results last week, the Department of Computer Science, which houses the core of the Surrey Centre for Cybersecurity, on research outputs, we came 7th out of the computer science and informatics return. So on our outputs, that shows how strong our outputs are, and over 50% were considered to be world leading, which is the top score. In fact, 57% at 4-star. So we're very, very proud of that, and that shows the strength of our research outputs in particular. And that's something that everybody in the centre was submitted to. It's 100% return. So that's breaking news, or it's last week's news, but it's relatively recent. So our areas of expertise, I'll just whiz through these. We do a lot on trusted systems and verification, and then various aspects of, say, blockchain and other kinds of distributed systems, and then we work in communications and networks and social media, and particularly the kind of network effects of social media, and applied cryptography that underpins an awful lot of what we do. So those are our particular areas of strength that those kind of research outputs were in. So that's the academic activity. But of course, we apply them in a number of application domains. So we work in these areas in particular: transport, government, so kind of electronic voting and so on, and digital identity, communications, and in finance. So those are the particular application areas that we have strong connections with. So we're always happy to talk to and make new contacts, make new connections. So happy to talk to you after the event if there are things where you see there's some commonality. So that's us, and I'll pass over. Is that us? Yes, so I'll pass over to SASIG. Or
Thanks,
pass back
Steve.
to Andrew.
Yeah, the REF is a big deal for universities. It only happens every few years, and we're really pleased with that. So, Joseph, tell us about SASIG.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thanks.
So we are the Security Awareness Special Interest Group. There we go, hopefully that's better. We're a networking forum for cybersecurity professionals. We currently have about 7,000 members, and we run regular networking and knowledge sharing events as well as webinars. So we currently run 3 webinars a week on various cybersecurity topics, and coming up from now till the end of the year, we have about 3 in-person events in London and around the country. We're getting to the northwest, the southwest. We're going up to Edinburgh this year. So there's lots going on. We always say a huge thank you to our supporters. They are our good friends who make everything we do possible. So huge thanks to all of them. A bit of a preview of webinars we've got coming up. So on Friday, tomorrow, we have Beyond the Lazarus Heist. That is with Jeff White, who is a very good journalist and writer. He's got a new book out. He's coming to talk to us about it. And we have How to Consider Governance when implementing effective risk management on Monday. Wednesday, we don't have a webinar because we are off to our big SASIG event, which I'll talk about in a second. And then we also have webinars about the MITRE attack framework and 10 times transformation of the Security Operations Center. And speaking of next week on Wednesday, we have our big SASIG. This is our big annual conference where we come and meet as end users with vendors as equals. That is a full day long conference as well as a dinner in the evening. Last chance to register is tomorrow. We'll be closing out after that. But head over to bigsasig.com if you're interested in finding out more. And then we also have some more in-person events. We're going to CGI in the walkie-talkie next month on the 28th of June, where we're talking about collaboration between business and law enforcement. We're doing that with the South East Regional Organised Crime Unit. We've also got Met Police there, City of London Police, as well as lots of private sector organisations and those in between, like the Business Resilience Centres. We have our Healthcare Cybersecurity Symposium. That one is hosted by Bupa. And we also have our Southwest one and quite a lot more coming up. The team included this one anyway, but if everyone's looking for a marketing role, we are hiring at the moment. So do let us know if you know anyone who's looking for a marketing role. You can find us online. We've got the website, thesasig.com. We have our LinkedIn and Twitter to find out more. So do go have a look and see what we're all about. And I think that's it for my slides. So I won't take up any more of your time, but thank you very much to Surrey for running this event with us.
Thanks, Joseph. It's been a real delight to work with the SASIG over the last few months. I've known the SASIG for many years, ever since their membership was a few dozen, and to go up to 7,000 has been an extraordinary achievement, especially over the pandemic, where they were blasting out webinars on a daily basis and have done several hundred, really keeping people very engaged, and all credit to the organisation. So to work with the university, I think, has been a real privilege and a lot of fun. So today we've got 4 speakers. We're talking about cyber and AI, where they come together, where they're different, where they're going. and we've got 4 speakers. So first up is Miko, who's joined us at the AI Institute, which is a new organisation within the university. Steve alluded to it. The AI Institute was formed about 5 months ago. The Surrey Institute of People-Centred AI, as I give it its formal title, which is really building on 35 years' worth of research that we've done in AI in places like the Centre for Vision, Speech and Signal Processing, with the UK's largest machine perception group, about 200 researchers. They're really turning it on its head and trying to get people focused. And Miko's leading some of the sort of the ethical and legal sides of AI. And then we've got Sturis, who's one of our leads in AI for computer science, and is going to be talking about some of the new research topics that I think should be interesting to you. And then Adrian from BA AI. I always look forward to Adrian's talks because there's always some interesting facts there that just coming out of the woodwork, which is always fun. And then Andy from Vodafone giving us a real sort of wide-scale commercial. We were just talking about the hybrid working and how the organisations are changing Vodafone as a proponent of hybrid working. Off topic for today. So we're going to have the talks themselves, about 15-20 minutes each. Save your questions and answers for the end, because what we'll do is we'll run a sort of panel session so everyone gets a chance to answer the questions, not just the individuals. So we'll run that to about 6, and then we'll go outside. If you want to stay around for networking and refreshments, you're very welcome. We are recording this session so that people can watch it afterwards. But without further ado, I'm going to ask Miko to kick off.
All right, many thanks, Andrew. I hope that everyone can hear me. I see that you are all nodding with approval, so let's say that we can start. It's a great pleasure to be here. As Andrew mentioned, I'm Miko, and I'm a lecturer of AI and regulation at the AI Institute. I'm also affiliated with the School of Law, and I'm not sure how I should activate this. Should be like this? Okay. So that's the topic of my presentation. It's about ethical and legal considerations of the use of autonomous cyber systems. And this will be rather an introductory presentation, but I will try to outline some of the non-trivial research questions and some of the issues that both academics and policymakers struggle with. So hopefully that will be interesting. And if you have any questions afterwards, please do let me know. I would be delighted to have a more in-depth chat afterwards. So without further ado, the major problem with many of these things, such as AI, cyber, and so forth, is of course related to the terminology. And there is such a unclarity when it comes to the basic foundational concepts of both big domains such as AI and cyber. And you probably know this very well, that this lack of clarity influences the debate, or rather makes the whole debate very difficult. So to begin with, I will just try to outline how I see some of the major concepts that I will be talking about. So first we have the difference between cyber weapons and autonomous cyber weapons. So here's the word autonomous, which makes the whole difference. But of course, it's a highly difficult concept to agree upon. So for instance, just to give you an example from practical world, since at least 2014, at the United Nations Forum, there is a discussion about the regulation of autonomous weapons. And up until now, we have 2022. So you can calculate 8 years. There is no agreed definition of what constitutes autonomous weapon systems. And simply because the term autonomy is so complex and difficult to grapple with. But I would say that cyber weapons are different from autonomous cyber weapons in a sense that they are particularly following the rules which are predetermined by the human operators. So they are not learning really from the environment and do not respond from some new input data from the environment, but rather they are strictly following the rules outlined by the programmers. And typically, cyber weapons are also authorized by human operators. So human operators either supervise those systems or can stop them, subject to specific considerations. Whereas autonomous cyber weapons exhibit some self-learning ability, in a sense that they are consuming data from environment, new data inputs, and those new data inputs influence the output of the system. And typically they are not authorized by humans. So of course human launches such systems, but then the system is self-intelligent, so reacts to specific inputs from the environment rather than waiting for the input from the human operator. So that's the very basic definition. It's not precise definition, but is the operational one. So based on specific examples, we can identify what sort of system exhibits autonomy or some degree of autonomy, and what sort of systems we should not classify as autonomous. And then one of the big discussion, but also one of the big challenge is that we have, of course, many degrees of automation along different chains of the system. So when you think, for instance, about weapon systems, you may have high degree of automation when it comes to the robotic system, but not necessarily automation at the level of engagement and targeting. So here is the important difference. AI weapons use AI in one of the areas of the larger chain of command, but not necessarily at the level of critical functions, that is engagement and targeting. Whereas autonomous weapon systems specifically use AI at the level of engagement and targeting. And that's why autonomous weapon systems are different than weaponized AI or some sort of weapon systems that use bits of AI along the wider chain of decision-making process. And then in the context of cyber, we have active and passive cyber defense, or offensive and defensive. By offensive cyber defense, we mean if systems which are having ability to hack back, in a sense. So once they are attacked, they are able to spot who the attacker is, or at least in theory they are able to identify to the large extent who the attacker might be, and then automatically respond to that attack by launching cyber offense. So there is a cyber offensive defense solution, but the passive ones are those which are not having the ability to hack back. So now we can move to an example of autonomous cyber weapon, which has been actually used in practice, has been in operation at least since 2005, but in 2010 it has been reported that such weapon has been used. It has been created most likely by the combination of the US and Israeli intelligence. It's called Stuxnet, and the novelty of the system was twofold. First of all, that was the first reported cyber weapon which was able to create actually physical damage. The physical damage specifically related to the nuclear facilities in Iran, in Natas. The second type of novelty was that it was a self-executable system, which essentially means that the system was able to, without further human input, go from one place to another, and just by taking data inputs from the Iranian infrastructure, explore vulnerabilities not only in the initial place, but also in some other areas. In total, the whole system was able to exploit 4 vulnerabilities that haven't been known by the Israeli IT professionals, and that has contributed significantly to the damage of the Iranian facilities. And then after that, some professionals from the company called Symantec have created a report which outlined why the Stuxnet was a game changer in cyber. And we can read that while attackers could control Stuxnet with a command and control server, the key computer was unlikely to have outbound internet access. Thus, all the functionality required to sabotage a system was embedded directly in the Stuxnet executable. And we have also quotation from Paul Shar. Paul Shar is the guy who has actually drafted a directive in the US on autonomous systems in 2012. And he wrote that once Stuxnet arrived at its target, it was on its own. Unlike other malware, it wasn't enough for Stuxnet to give its designers access. Stuxnet had to perform the mission autonomously. And there are some other type of advanced systems which are in this area. Of course, you may know the company called Darktrace, and Darktrace is not just a single company in that area, but they are pretty advanced in passive defense. It's a company here in the UK. Then Mayhem is both passive and active defense. They have the ability to hack back. Is the program developed by DARPA in 2016. Stuxnet, of course, at least since 2005, they were working on that one. And Duku is an interesting example. Many people claim that actually it's the Stuxnet brother, Stuxnet sister, in a sense that actually the whole infrastructure behind Duku is very similar to Stuxnet, but it has been used for different purposes, not for damage of Iranian facilities, but rather for intelligence purposes, for data gathering. And why to discuss autonomous cyber weapons? First of all, as we can see already, those technologies are in place, and they have been having certain, although still minimal, but yet impact on various organizations. There are arguments against and in favor of using autonomy in cyber, particularly when it comes to the offensive cyber weapons, because there are many risks. I will outline some of them, but one which immediately comes to mind is the risk that we won't be able to control how the escalation of such response could happen, and how many parties can be affected, potentially not necessarily only those that we want to affect. And there is a lack of academic apparatus to understand and address their effects. This is all very new, and this is an emerging field in research. Now I will go to 2 slides where I will discuss first ethical challenges and then legal challenges. So very quickly, ethical challenges of autonomous active defense is first that it's so hard to control how the offensive defense is looks like can look like in practice, simply because these are autonomous systems, and we will need to have strong confidence in how those systems react to specific data inputs from the environment. And even though we may test those systems quite comprehensively, there may still be some edge cases, some data which may influence the system response to the extent that we won't be able to control the effects of such system. And that may have, of course, significant negative consequences on various parties, because if the response is not clearly targeted to the attacker, then some other people might be vulnerable, and then the response is not proportionate, it's not distinct in a sense, it's not discriminate in a sense that tackles only specific entity. And that, of course, has implications in law, which I will touch upon in a moment. Then the second thing is, but there are some ways how to constrain a self-governing weapon, which I think comes to the question, which is really big in current settings. So how to constrain a autonomous offensive weapon, cyber weapon. There are ways how to do it, particularly when it comes to the constraining of loiter or constraining the time of response. So there are some ways how to do it, but this is very much a relevant question. Then the second problem is problem which is known in cyber as attribution problem. So how to detect specifically who was the malicious party who created a specific damage. And then if we are unable to attribute the attacker, then we have, of course, problems how to respond to that specific party. Then the third problem is related to the complexity of a defense system, because it may well be that there is no single attack, but rather the intrusion is permanent. For instance, we have electric grid, and the intruder is constantly monitoring electric grid and is able to increase the malicious activity once some conditions are present, but it's always there. So how to respond to the permanent intrusion and how to then differentiate from the strategic standpoint if someone will escalate on top of the permanent intrusion. And then the final bit is related to the command and control pressures. In many of the cases, there are supply chain risks. For instance, some of the systems may come from not necessarily parties which conform to the same security standards that we have in other bits, and then that may represent some of the challenges. One of the big problem, of course, is related to data risks. So there may be instances where we are having certain portion of data which are clean and not vulnerable, but then we merge that data with other data which might be poison, and that may influence the outcome of our models. And that's, of course, a big problem, how to know which kind of data are potentially poison. Then there are some legal challenges of active defense. First of all, the big problem is related to arms control. So traditionally, when it comes to more conventional weapons, there are certain limitations of how to distribute those weapons, and those limitations have been present in the conventions. That said, it's probably very unlikely that we will have anything like that in cyber. And as at the moment, as we speak, there is no agreed treaty or agreements when it comes to the use of some of the code. So there is, including the malicious code. So there is actually a very large space unregulated, and many of the malicious codes are being are being used by other parties, and we are unable to control the transfer of this knowledge. So that's one of the big problems: how to actually create the effective mechanisms that allow to transfer the knowledge according to certain ethical and legal principles in that field specifically. Then the second problem is how to test and verify autonomous cyber weapons. In many cases, this is the broader problem of how to test and verify AI models in general. And there are already some interesting solutions in the market, in the commercial market, which aim to provide the framework for AI models to become more explicable, transparent, and robust. But this is, of course, the challenge: how to run such testing and verification in outside the well-known domain of our governments and essentially outside our own use of such systems. So the big problem is that once we will conform to specific standards of testing and verification, how we can enforce, how we can influence other parties that they will conform to similar standards. And then even if they might be interested in testing and verifying their own AI models, how we can supply the knowledge in secure way so that they can actually use that. And how then external parties can validate this testing and verification procedures internationally, given the sensitive nature of these technologies. So this is of course one of the big problems. And as of now, many governments have their own solutions, particularly by partnering with some companies offering assessment models for verification models for AI models, but there is lack of more general knowledge that can be extracted from these practices. Then the third problem is with respect to responsibility and accountability gap. So assuming that some system contributed unwanted damage, then who is the person responsible for that unwanted consequence? And traditionally, we have the doctrine of state responsibility, which means that the government is responsible for any malicious activities of their own parties. But in some specific cases, the damage could be so significant that the specific individual is responsible for the war crimes. And it's not uncommon to think about war crimes that actually might occur with respect to the use of autonomous cyber weapons. So then the problem is how to assign such individual responsibility to who might be responsible. Is it a programmer or the person who authorized specific weapon? That's another big question that many try to answer. And the final bit is with respect to the law of armed conflict. Irrespective of what we can think about international law, there are many people who believe that this is the framework to conform with, and this is the only framework that we have that allows us to understand the impact of malicious activities at the international level. And here the big problem is how to make autonomous cyber weapons compliant with the principle of distinction and proportionality. So specifically how such weapons will be able to discriminate between valid targets and invalid targets, and then how the potential hacking back will be proportionate to the damage that has occurred to us. So these are another big questions that academics and policymakers are dealing with. And having said so, there is very little or almost none specific regulations which could guide the answer to these questions, which is surprising, but which might be surprising, but certainly it's a big problem. So there are two separate streams of discussions at the United Nations group of government experts. One is with respect to the robotic systems, autonomous weapons, which are robotic systems, which are in the kinetic domain. And the second stream of discussion is with respect to purely cyber topics, which some argue that may not necessarily move forward those problems because there might be more similarities than differences between those two. But anyway, those discussions are for many years now and with very little progress. There has been some progress when it comes to the best practices or technical rules when it comes to the use of cyber more generally, not necessarily with respect to the combination with AI. But Tallinn Manual in 2013 and Tallinn Manual 2 in 2017 is the example of a scholarship body which rose to the prominence and is essentially used by international institutions when there are some specific problems, challenges related to the use of cyber systems, particularly cyber weapons and malicious activity. But these are these sources are not formally part of international law. They have been used as a mode of practice in the context where we don't have any specific regulations. And there is one directive in the US specifically on autonomous weapons. It has been created in 2012, but it excludes cyber weapons and autonomous cyber weapons specifically. And the exclusion of cyber from the US DoD was because they knew bureaucratically it would be very hard to create a new policy on autonomy. It might be even harder if they could include cyber. So that was the reason. So autonomous cyber weapons are a completely unregulated field, both internationally and domestically in the US. The directive which is there also is quite interesting as a legal instrument because it is a directive and a policy guideline, but it's not a hard law. So essentially it is a guidance for the US policymakers to implement specific protective measures, but these protective measures can be waived in specific circumstances, for instance, in the context of urgent military need. And of course, that only applies to the very limited context of the US. And then some questions, which I believe are quite interesting. So first question is, when cyber attacks represent an unlawful use of force, so of course, in the context of international law, and also in the context of Tallinn Manual, which is the body of best practices in cyber, we have the principle of state sovereignty. And actually, it was a very interesting and long discussion about whether cyber operations should fall into the principle of state sovereignty, with many claim that actually should not. Because according to that principle, a state must not conduct cyber operations that violate the sovereignty of another state. And then, of course, some people argue that this is a too restrictive provision that would essentially become totally impractical because of the current ecosystem where we have cyber attacks on a daily basis undermining many states in various respects. So what kind of cyber attack violates state sovereignty if we will consider that state sovereignty is something like a strong principle? It's not thus if when someone will hack the specific bank, then the state sovereignty is affected. It's something bigger than that. So what really is the state sovereignty with that respect? So the prominent view is that the disruption must be significant enough to affect state security, as opposed to just penetrating national infrastructure. So if there is a cyber attack which just, or cyber intrusion that is just able to get all the data from national bank, this is apparently less of the violation of state sovereignty according to the dominant recognition, because one can argue it's not the disruption that will affect the whole state security. But it's a controversial view, and it's all unclear whether that will be indeed the interpretation. Then the question further is whether physical damage is necessary or mere physical presence of a human subject. Funny enough, the current dominant interpretation is that the mere physical presence of a human subject will suffice. So, for instance, in the context of Stuxnet affected the state security, so affected the state sovereignty, so it was the illegal use of cyber weapon. It wasn't authorized by the United Nations Security Council, so the United States and Israel, according to this interpretation, are parties which unlawfully use the force. But then, assuming that Stuxnet would have much more minimal damage, if there was a person from the US or Israel on the Iranian ground and supplying the UBS with malicious code, then it would classify as the undermining of the state sovereignty. And even though the damage might be minimal, according to the dominant interpretation, it would be still the violation of state sovereignty, irrespective of the size of the physical damage of the weapon itself. So just wrapping things up, there is another interesting question of how to respond to cyber attacks. So I will just comment very quickly that the big problem in the literature is that, of course, we know generally how to respond to the acts of war, but we don't know how to respond to the accumulation of attacks which are just below the threshold of war. That's the concept which is called unpeace, and we don't have the theory behind how the government should respond to the state of unpeace. There are some other interesting topics around that, but I will not dwell into this. Hopefully that was interesting, but I'm happy to discuss and happy to take any questions that you may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Miko. And as I said, save your questions for the end, and we'll get them around the panel. So it's my great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Sotiris.
Thank you, Andrew. So hello, everyone. Just get the right slide. So hello, everyone. So I'm Sotiris Mosogiannis. I'm an academic in the Department of Computer Science here at Surrey. I'm a member and a co-fellow of the People-Centered AI Institute, the newly formed institute that Andrew mentioned earlier, and I'm also an associate member of the Surrey Center for Cybersecurity that Steve talked to you about earlier. So it would appear I'm in a good position to tell you a bit about the crossovers between AI and cybersecurity in some of the work we're doing. By means of introduction, I'll say that my research is mostly on the interface between AI and network science. So I would say I try to come up with ways to intervene where and when and what action in networks in order to steer them towards a desirable outcome. And in terms of cybersecurity, the bubble at the top that you see there, I'm mostly looking at threat intelligence, multi-stage attacks, so APTs and things like Lazarus Heist will turn up in a bit, and quite a bit on intrusion, on network intrusion detection. So the desired outcome in this context takes the form of some analysis on the network, some formal analysis on the network that can have implications towards some security property or some threat intelligence or some protection against threats. I'll start a bit on the AI side and then move on to the security and the cyber crossovers, as I said in the title. So a good question to ask when you work with or when you hear about AI is, does AI learn? Right? And if it does, what does it learn, actually? Right? And I might be overloading the AI term. It's overloaded anyway. So replace AI there on the slide with your favorite machine learning algorithm. Let's say attention networks nowadays or whatever you fancy most. Graph neural networks and so on. So does it learn, and what does it learn? Okay, so that is an interesting question to ask. And I'll walk you through an example to try to answer that, or to give you a glimpse of what I mean by learning, or what we mean by learning. Okay? So bear with me on this slide. It's a toy example. So we represent weather conditions and the time of day in binary format. Okay? So we say, for example, what have I got there? So cloudy, 1, not cloudy, 0. Right? Windy, 1. Not windy, 0. Daytime, 1, evening, 0, and so on. And we're after a system that recommends whether to take an umbrella or not. Okay? So if the system knows these facts, okay, so if I know already, if cloudy, windy, evening, so if that's the condition of the world, then take umbrella, which would be encoded in the binary format described as 111 semicolon 1, 110, sorry, semicolon 1. And I also know, the system also knows in its rule base or in its knowledge base, cloudy, windy morning, then take umbrella, which will be encoded like this. Then what happens is that the system will generalize to this rule. So it say, if cloudy, windy, then take umbrella. So it would be encoded as 1 hash semicolon 1. So the hash agrees with everything. So essentially, it has dropped the condition of the time of day. Right? So what I'm getting at is that what we mean by learning, actually, in this context, is having less rules than inputs, while still being able to address all possible inputs. So instead of knowing these two rules now, I can get rid of those and I can only hold this, because that will answer the question that I have as a target. Okay? From a practical perspective, what this tells me, or what the system has learned, what the algorithm has learned, is that in the decision on whether to take an umbrella or not, the time of day doesn't play a role. So you're looking at the features like cloudy and windy, other features of the input that will decide the output, that will decide the outcome. Okay? And I've shown you this now in rule-based machine learning, and learning classifier systems in particular, if you're into this kind of thing, because I like the explainability of it, so we humans can understand the rules, in this story example, and the machine can understand the zeros and the ones. So that explains how we have arrived, or what we have learned, but it applies more or less across the board. Okay? So that's a bit on learning. So I ask now a similar question when it comes to prediction. So say, can AI predict? And what does it actually need in order to make a prediction, let alone a good prediction? Right? And the answer here is a little bit more trivial, if you like, because, for example, we have been used to predicting the weather. Right? And we do a good job of that, before AI became trendy, even. Right? So mind you, the Met uses a 2 billion computing infrastructure, I'm told, to make the prediction. Right? And still, we're much better at predicting the weather tomorrow or in 12 hours' time rather than a month ahead. Right? So there will be a prediction on what the weather will be like in 2 Thursdays from now, but that will be updated when we get closer to that time. Okay? Because you feed in the new data to the model and you have a more accurate prediction as you go on. But leaving these caveats aside, we're very good in predicting the weather, for example. Okay? We are also good, or we're getting used to machines being able to tell cats from dogs. Right? So supervised learning on labeled data. Right? So if you feed it a bunch of images of a dog and a bunch of images of a cat, of cats, and you give them the labels, which one is which, the algorithm will eventually learn that cats have whiskers, for example, and dogs don't. Right? And once it learns that, once it converges, as we say, on the training data, then you can give it an image that it hasn't seen before, and it will very likely predict correctly the label on that image. It will tell you if it's a dog or a cat. Okay? So that we do well. Okay? Again, there's some caveats there in that typically you need a lot of data to do that, or it might take some time to converge and so on. And you need the supervisor or the expert to label, to annotate all these images, right, to tell you what they are. Which in the simple example I'm describing, it's okay, but in more complex environments, it's not a trivial thing to do. Now, being successful with this, we have moved to more adventurous, let's say, predictions, like in more unpredictable environments. So we say, what is the likelihood of my train being late tomorrow? Right? We want to slice that prediction per station, per train operating company, per region, per whatever you want. Okay? Or what is the likely next stage of a multi-stage attack, let's say, okay? In the context of advanced persistent threats, and I'll talk a little bit about this, about the last point in the next few slides. So just to put this in context, in the recent project that we've been working on, learning how to do with learning individual passengers' preferences, for example. Okay, to give you an example of an application in the real world. So we were learning if people liked cycling, if people like walking only when the sun was out and not when it was raining, and so on and so forth. Okay, and we use then prediction to predict the alternative route that best matches these preferences, the preferences of an individual passenger, and use that to suggest that route upon the event of a major disruption. Okay? So again, with rule-based machine learning here, so this is the input here. You see it's a little bit more involved. Okay, so you can't see my point. So it's a little bit more involved now, the input. It's not just zeros and ones. It's a few more features and a bit more involved. And let's say, human for now, we run the rule-based algorithm and give us the answer 2. Okay, and 2 might be jump on the Santander bike and cycle to the next station because the other line on the tube is not delayed, for example. Okay? And then if we start asking also, was this the right action to suggest, and we take some feedback from the user and say, yes, you're right, I love riding the bike, so that was a good idea, or I hate riding bikes, so that was wrong, then we can reinforce that answer and make sure that we give that answer if we have that input, or we don't give that answer again if it wasn't the right one. Okay? So I mentioned supervised learning earlier. Now I'm moving towards reinforcement learning. So we don't have labeled data here, but we use a reward signal to reinforce good answers to the situations we have experienced before. Okay? And that's about it on the AI side. Okay? So that was the AI intro, if you like. So I don't have a security intro as such, because I thought, partly because of the time constraints, but also because of the audience. I guess you might know the security intro better than I do. I'll just, by means of introduction, I was going to put up a few notorious attacks. I saw the Lazarus Heist come up on Joseph's slides, so the SASIG group are looking at it in one of your next meetings. So I won't say a lot about that. So you've heard about it, I guess, right? So APT 38. Yeah, so one of the things these guys tried to do was to make the biggest steal of the biggest bank theft, right? $1 billion, trying to transfer it from the Bangladesh Federal Reserves to Philippines via the Fed in New York. Okay, I'll just say, and you might have this later, that it becomes a little bit more complicated, or it shows you the sophistication of these attacks, the fact that they managed to compromise the SWIFT system via the printer. Right, so they found the weakest link in the room, in the 10th floor of the Bangladesh Central Bank, and that was the printer. So the printer stopped printing. And when they found out that they couldn't fix it, they just rebooted it, and that's when the attack started. So then it issued all this backlog of transactions to the Fed in New York to say transfer this money to this bank in the Philippines. Okay? It was staged 8:45 a.m. on Friday in the Bangladesh local time. That was 8 p.m. in New York, so nobody was double checking except from emergency staff. This bunch of things coming in. Interesting, also the bank the bank they were directing the funds to was in the Philippines. In the Philippines, it was a national holiday that weekend. Right? So by juggling the time zones in 3 different places in the world, they have created a clear 5-day run to take the money. Right? You probably know that they weren't quite successful. They got about 100 million of the 1 billion, but that's still quite a big. It makes quite a nice case study. The other thing to note, perhaps another example, you might know this also, the hack of Ukraine's power grid. Okay, so that caused the power outage of about half a million households. Wired, which reports to it now, it's reported in other places, tell us that cyber criminals got into the networks and then handed the information to nation-state cyber warfare teams. Okay? It took about 6 hours to bring back the stations, to bring back the electricity to the stations, and 16 of them, if I remember correctly in the report, it took months to recover because the perpetrators were able to install firmware in those stations, which didn't allow the recovery teams to access them remotely. Right? So, and this, by the way, was 2016, so it's nothing to do with the current Russian invasion of Ukraine and so on. Just to be clear. So the common thing here, sorry, I've got one more here. Yeah, I've got the Stuxnet here, so that came up also. I think, Nico, you mentioned it, and other people mentioned it. So that was the first real cyber attack, right, 10 years ago. They ran a nuclear facility, and US and Israel were the common suspects in this case. That attack was 10 years in the planning, actually, apparently, and there are books about it and so on and so forth. So what I'm getting at is that the common theme here is that you have some attacks that are sophisticated, right? So they include from time zones and when somebody has a national holiday and so on and so forth. In addition to the digital aspect, they are persistent, okay? They are well-funded teams that are willing to carry out these attacks, and they have multiple stages, so they don't happen at once. It's not just somebody stealing your password, right? So they evolve over time. And typically, these groups try to get a strong foothold in some network of high importance, right? Or highly visible, highly strategic networks. On the point of networks, you will have heard of 5G networks. There is a well-known 5G, 6G research center here at Surrey, which looks at every aspect of this technology. What I'm interested in, or in the context of what we're talking about here, is the softwareization of the network. which the 5G technology has brought about, which we didn't have before 5G, for example. Okay, so we've got a new service-based architecture that adopts HTTP2, so all the vulnerabilities of HTTP come into it now. We have software-defined networking, network function visualization, so colleagues there from 5G will know all about that. So all this essentially makes a much wider attack surface. Okay? And I won't go through all of this. This is a busy slide, so I don't expect you to read all of that. I'll just pick out the higher data rates, which means that deep packet inspection becomes problematic. I'll pick out perhaps lower latency, which makes well-known and successful security measures, such as encryption, limited. We have a limited application here. And the dynamic reconfiguration, so the network keeps changing, so whatever security measures or security monitoring you apply needs to take that into account, that the topology keeps changing. So this makes this kind of networks a fertile ground for cyber attacks. And briefly back to the multi-stage attacks and the examples I was talking about earlier. There are various stages here. They won't apply to every multi-stage attack or every APT, but roughly you've got a defensive version, so getting into the discovery, so finding that the printer is the least leak. So what does the printer do? It issues the transaction, backlog of transactions. I can use that to do command and control later and so on. Now, in this multi-stage, what we try to do to move that with here, apply different for identifying the attack. So, detect the attack, find what stage and trying to predict the next stage of the attack. And then enforce them to detect the best action that takes into account what thinker, what more likely that they will do next. Publish the stage model here, the book on issues, technology, Opel, it's reading that the CSC. Counter is similar amount of center of the market, which also because of slide. So what you have heard of, I guess, you, yeah. So, don't what attacks. So, like, so the attack is common mode. So, attack already know description, tactic. TT. So want to achieve a technique they will use procedures implement. Keep going on this one. See if that works. parts of those. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. I feel really guilty for trying to be strict on time, but there's so much to talk about. So without further ado, let's switch straight to Adrian. Thank you.
Well, hello, good afternoon, and thank you for the invitation to come and speak at this today. Some great presentations so far, so I hope I can add a bit to the discussion. So my name is Adrian Nish, and I work for BAE Systems, and I worked with BAE for about 12 years now. My background prior to BAE, I did a PhD in physics, so I had a strong kind of data science background. And I now joined BAE to do that type of work. And I got thrown into a cybersecurity project. No background in cybersecurity, but I was there to write algorithms to help detect network intrusions using logs that were coming off customer networks where they knew they had an intrusion, but they didn't know necessarily where the actor was in the network. So we used the logs to detect that. So I've worked in cybersecurity my whole time in BA, the last 12 years. I spent a little bit of time looking at machine learning algorithms, part of what we're using to implement that kind of network threat detection. So I'll kind of touch on a little bit of that in a moment. But I thought what I kind of start with is just a really high-level state of the nation where we're at in cybersecurity at the moment. And then I'll talk a little bit about AI. And I'll come back to this and I'll say, right, is AI actually going to help with some of these, or is it potentially going to be a bit of a problem? So first off, the kind of main problems that we have in cybersecurity still today generally resolve around getting the basics right. We know what to do, but getting organizations to actually implement this in rigorous ways is really difficult still. So I'm talking about simple things like patch management, or passwords, or prevention of social engineering. These are attacks that have been around forever, and we still see them being used in real-world attacks when we go in and do incident response. They're key kind of problems, and all organizations still struggle with this. So we haven't found good approaches to managing any of these yet. The second problem is that the market and the incentives around cybersecurity are fundamentally broken. So buyers in cybersecurity are faced with an almost bewildering array of options from the market, and they have very little knowledge about what those solutions, those options can actually do to help. So this might be particular point solutions around how to detect a threat. It might be point solutions on how to provide insights into vulnerabilities or mitigate impact. But it's very difficult to kind of get a risk-balanced approach when organizations are often faced with limited budgets and so on. And on the other side, the sellers not necessarily particularly open about what the solution can do, what it can't do. So there's a lot of kind of snake oil salespeople out there still. We don't really have good kind of regulations or standards or independent testing in the industry.
Testing.
The impact of cyber breaches just continues to get more and more significant as well. I mean, you just have to think back to some of the big cases over the past couple of years, things like oil pipelines being disrupted, food logistics being disrupted, whole healthcare systems, the Irish healthcare system, for example, being taken offline by ransomware attackers. And this is only just going to get worse in the next few years as we get things like Fitbit and other kind of health trackers that we become dependent on as we get connected autonomous vehicles and other things. So the trajectory that we're on in this is challenging. Also, how we think about trust is changing in cybersecurity. Years ago, when I started, for example, 12 years ago, the general enterprise network was built a bit like a castle. You had firewalls on the outside, and generally stuff inside the network was trusted, and you use the firewall to keep the outside stuff, the internet, away from the stuff that you trust. That just doesn't work anymore. Now we have cloud, now we have hybrid working. That boundary doesn't really exist on corporate networks anymore. At the same time, we're also faced with this fundamental kind of balkanization of the internet and balkanization of technology. And again, we're on a trajectory here that I think is slightly inevitable, and we need to think about how do we kind of manage the risks around that. And the final challenge, which in some ways is a bit of a contributing factor to some of the other problems, is that we have emerging technology. So the technology landscape is constantly changing. Things like cloud have fundamentally changed how we do security. It's changed how we deploy products. It's changed some of the companies. A company called FireEye, for example, really big name 10 years ago. FireEye doesn't really exist as a brand anymore. Its product is almost obsolete in the current cybersecurity regime. So these new emerging technologies have quite a fundamental impact on the market and the whole ecosystem. And I think AI is just another one of these things that's also kind of adding complexity into this space as well. So if we talk a little bit about AI, I'm going to break this into 3 different sections. And some of this has already been covered, but we have uses of AI for cybersecurity. So some of the stuff that Satiris talked about how we can use AI to detect advanced attacks, for example. We, of course, have attacker use of AI. And so Miko actually talked about some of this already. And we have attacks against AI systems. So we have the cybersecurity of AI as another kind of thing to consider. So I'll cover the first one, using AI for cybersecurity. So in my background in terms of writing threat detection algorithms, we dabbled with using machine learning as one of the approaches. And so I wrote a classifier for domains and IPs about 10 years ago. And it was a way you could use supervised learning to say, right, that's a good domain, that's a bad domain, hence flag that up for investigation. When I was upskilling in this, I did an online course that was run by Stanford University, a guy called Sebastian Trun, who is quite famous in the world of AI because he was the team lead for the team that won the first DARPA Grand Challenge, this self-driving car challenge. It was the first time anybody completed the challenge, and his team won. And in this course, he talked about or he used an example which was using a machine learning algorithm for detection of email spam. And this was kind of just a classic example that already existed probably 10 years prior to that. And this was 10 years ago I was doing the course. So we've been talking about using machine learning for cybersecurity for at least 20 years already. And it's true that the state of the art has advanced, and we now see this in many different areas. But I think what we've got is lots of different kind of point solutions for where we can deploy machine learning and general kind of artificial intelligence solutions. I'm still a little bit skeptical about how much of a game changer it can be in cybersecurity, because a lot of the fundamental challenges that we have are really hard problems for machine learning and AI to actually tackle. I mean, if you compare, let's say, something like writing an algorithm to learn how to play chess, you can imagine how you can do this through supervised learning and setting up the rules, even writing a system that can learn the rules itself. Chess is a relatively closed system. It has a set of rules. It is adversarial, but it has a set of fixed rules. Cyber isn't really like that. Enterprise networks are constantly evolving. The landscape within a single enterprise network is constantly evolving. And attackers don't play fair, right? They break the rules. So they don't have to use the kind of protocols and the systems and the way that they were designed to. They will find ways around them. They will exploit those systems, things we just don't even know about, zero-day vulnerabilities and so on. So I think this is quite a hard thing for AI systems to actually cope with. You don't have a kind of a nice closed a closed environment that you can allow the system. You have a constantly dynamic environment with a very clever adversary who's trying to exploit that. It's a particularly difficult problem. There are simpler things that we can use AI for, like log parsing, for example, elements of automation, other aspects of classification. And always have to go for the hardest problems. There's still lots of things that we can use AI and ML to help with. So the second of these topics, so attacker use of AI. There's not a lot of kind of concrete evidence out there for attackers using AI and ML at present. There's a few examples of deepfake kind of synthetic media being used for social engineering attacks. So there's a case in 2020 where a company's director's voice was imitated, apparently using a deepfake program to basically social engineer their bank manager into transferring some money. So apparently $35 million US. So you can kind of imagine how that's quite an attractive thing in terms of social engineering. We probably will see more of those types of attacks. But the vast amount of kind of cases in this space are academic research and kind of red team approaches to how you can attack different systems. There are some interesting examples, though. So one example is how AI and ML can be used in an area called vulnerability fuzzing. So when you're doing vulnerability research, one of the approaches that you can take is doing fuzzing. So you have something like an API and you send lots of requests into the API to basically measure the response of the software, of the program. And if the program crashes, you know that you found some kind of flaw in the program that potentially is something you can exploit. So fuzzing is one of the techniques that's used by researchers to uncover these flaws. And there are already people looking at how you can use AI and ML to do more advanced fuzzing. If you kind of talk to some of the people who do this research, fuzzing is like the last resort. You generally try a lot of other approaches, and if nothing's working, you try the brute force approach, which is fuzzing. So I think there's still probably some approaches that maybe you could take with AI and ML, where it's more about helping some semi-skilled researchers to get a bit more through this. It's more of the kind of what people call intelligence augmentation as opposed to artificial intelligence. The other interesting area here where there's a good application of AI and ML is where data has already been stolen from a network. So kind of after the cyber attack has actually happened, data's been stolen, it's been leaked onto the internet or something like that. If you've ever kind of looked into this, like WikiLeaks sites or any of the newer ones, there's a huge amount of stuff out there. It's just too much to actually interrogate and for anybody to look through. So you've almost, at the moment, got this sort of situation of continued kind of security through obscurity because there's just so much data out there. But actually with AI and ML, we can get into doing things like natural language processing. So less skilled people, like maybe investigative journalists, can begin to ask more thorough questions of that data in mass that's out there. So some of those kind of secrets that are already disclosed may become more relevant. Obviously in the kind of intelligence community, this is of massive use as well, where they've got access to reams of data, but actually exploiting that data, getting useful insights out of it is half the challenge. The final example, which I think Miko covered quite well already, is the concept of autonomous payloads. So these are malware code that will go into a system and carry out an attack in an autonomous fashion. We've already seen cases like Stuxnet already, sort of over 14 years ago. But Stuxnet was very much I would say, implemented with logic steps. So it was a classic if-then do this, if-then else type logic. The concept of kind of full sort of autonomous systems is they would be able to react a bit more in real time to the environment and make their own decisions. I think it's a really interesting one to debate, I think, from a legal perspective, but also from I think an efficacy perspective, because how particularly military thinkers go about decision making, it's not just about the kind of cost and effectiveness of the solution, but also how reliable is it. If you're a military decision maker and you want to take out a particular target, you want to know with 90+% confidence it's going to take out that target. You don't really want to be dealing with yes, maybe 40% is likely to work. That just isn't a good option. You'll just use something else basically instead. So in the military, they like certainty that's going to have the effect. And I think it's very difficult. It would be very difficult to create an autonomous AI system that you could give a military planner that type of certainty. But I think people will probably experiment with this. They will probably explore the space. So the final example then is attacks against AI systems. And again, I think this is mostly a sort of theoretical attack space. There's been a couple of examples. So there's one famous case of a Twitter chatbot that was an autonomous Twitter chatbot. And it very quickly learnt the sort of language of social media, the sort of toxic language of social media, and it quickly got taken back off of Twitter. But most of the examples that exist in this space come from research, and I think it's an emerging specialism in itself. Satiris mentioned the MITRE ATT&CK project. There's actually a specific MITRE ATT&CK matrix for adversarial machine learning. And this goes into some of the theoretical attacks that people have done against machine learning systems to sort of build out that kind of taxonomy of different attacks. It's quite complicated, but broadly it splits into two parts. One is attacks against the training environment, if you like. So these are things like people trying to discover the underlying data set or put some poison the data set that goes into the training. And the other is attacks against, I guess, the deployed system, so the real live system. And there an attacker might be able to exploit that system to rediscover the trained model, for example, to be able to then do further attacks, which might be, I don't know, for monetary gain or something like that. So, it's worth, if you're interested in the space, it's definitely worth going looking up the adversarial machine learning project. It's on GitHub and on MITRE as well. So just coming back to the cybersecurity challenges. So the first one, in terms of getting the basics right, I think here we need to focus on how we can build systems which are more tolerant to vulnerabilities and exploitation. We've got to get broader adoption of more modern approaches to identity and access management, for example. We're still giving out lots of instructions to people on how to create better passwords. And I'm like, geez, can we just get rid of the passwords? Why are we reliant on people to come up with more complex things? It is just making the problem harder. We should be able to build systems which don't rely necessarily on the people to be doing something, but can just sort of use some attribute of either what they've got in their hands, like a multi-factor token, or biometrics, for example. So I think AI has a role to play in helping this, particularly on things like the biometrics and confirming, is that the same person? Yes, I can trust that now to grant that access. The second problem, in terms of market and incentives, so we absolutely need more professionalization in cybersecurity. If you go to a doctor, you can look on the wall, the doctor's got a certificate that says they're a professional. If you go to engineers, you've got chartered engineers and so on. We don't have this really in cybersecurity. Yes, we have it in certain areas like pen testing. You can find people who've got certain certifications, but we don't have it broadly as a sector, which is kind of crazy at this stage. We haven't done it. It's starting to happen. We need to do more of that. Strange for somebody who works in a company to get up and say, we need more regulation. I mean, Andrew's already laughing at the idea, but it is a space that if the market is broken, it is an area that government needs to step in and do something. I think there is work already, particularly in the telecoms industry around this. Can AI help? Maybe, but we need to be careful of, again, this is a complicated domain, and making it look even more complicated with lots of new solutions is just going to make the challenge for the buyers even greater. But maybe tackling this alongside the professionalization and regulation might help. In terms of the impact of cyber breaches, so we're reasonably good at measuring threat. Things like the MITRE ATT&CK matrix give us models that we can use to do that well. We're pretty good at measuring vulnerabilities. We've got lots of that as well, in terms of what comes out of kind of vulnerability scanning, what comes out of work that MITRE do around CVEs and things like that. Who does this for impacts, though? We're really rubbish at measuring impacts. And actually, that's a really important part of that whole equation, because you can't create a risk equation without understanding the impact. So we need to do more about that. And I don't know if there is an AI solution in there somewhere, but we need to do better about measuring impact. In terms of trust, so we're already on a course here of diverging technology. The geopolitics of the day has us on this trajectory, and it's going to be difficult to come back from that anytime soon. So we need to minimize the impact of the diverging technology. It's not just the kind of balkanization of the internet and Russia switching off from the internet. This is wholesale, right from the microprocessors through to the data centers, through to the applications. We are going in different directions at the moment. So we need to minimize the impact of it by finding, common ground, by finding, standards that everybody can agree on, common values and so on. And that's obviously going to be very important in AI. And I think we need to use AI as a way that we can, restore trust and not continue, this balkanization. And then finally, we need to harness the potential of new technologies, but not forget the old lessons. It's very quick for engineers to kind of race into things and go, yeah, it's going to be brilliant, and I built it already, let's deploy it. And often you see actually there's old attack types, there's old vulnerabilities that people, they haven't factored into what they're doing. I think we're already, doing a great job as a community to try and understand what the vulnerabilities are in AI before we see lots of attacks. So the work again that MITRE are doing and people contributing into those projects, it's theoretical work, but it is building upon good foundations that we've already got in the industry. So I think we need to continue with this. Let's harness the potential of AI, but ensure we understand the potential attacks and have mitigations in place. So yeah, thank you very much.
Thanks, Adrian. Perfect. And now for our final speaker, Andy from Vodafone.
Thanks, Andrew. Cool. Hey, everyone. Thank you very much for having me. So I'm Andy Deacon, otherwise known as the man with the world's longest job title. It's so big now it doesn't fit on slides anymore. As you progress at Vodafone, they just seem to add more words to your job title. Really, I've got to sort that out. But what I do basically is I lead a team of people, and our sole existence in the world is to take really complicated terms, references and all that sort of stuff and simplify them and make them understandable to the general marketplace so that they can actually act on them and understand them. It's a bigger challenge than what you think. So I'm going to take you through some of the problems that we see and some of the things that we run into on a daily basis and what the industry is struggling with as a whole for both AI and cyber and how they're coming together. The biggest thing is this. There's two terms, artificial intelligence, cyber security. They are a host of nuance. And when we talk about them, actually we are talking about very specific things within that. We have to get much better at saying what that specific thing is. So, quick primer, this is what I'm talking about. Cyber is not just this, it's cyber warfare, it's cyber espionage, it's cyber attack and it's cyber crime. All of them have different aims, all of them have different techniques, all of them have different targets. But what we do as an industry is we lump them together all as one, as cyber. So how do people on the other end of it understand, with no knowledge at all, what this specific nuance is that we're talking about? We've got to get much more precise here in what we're saying and what that means for people as an outcome. If you take artificial intelligence, wow, that's even worse. And it's still growing, right? And there's lots of debate around this, so for all the AI bods in the room, don't shoot me for what I'm about to say. But essentially it fits into three things. You've got narrow intelligence, general and super. So general and super is equal to human, advanced human. Narrow intelligence is the sort of machine learning, what's typically called weak, so weak AI. But even underneath that, there's loads of other terms which you've already heard about today. So you've got machine learning, you've got neural networks, you've got deep learning. It's essentially Russian dolls stacked on top of each other. Again, this makes it really difficult to understand, actually, especially when cyber and AI come together. What are you talking about here? What's your tool set? What's the aim? We've got to get much better at this. So where is this leading? Well, actually, there's a massive arms race going on at the moment. Now, is it an arms race or a harms race? I'm from Leicester, so I don't know whether you catch the H in there or not. It's interesting to say, right? So we have an arms race at a geopolitical thing. There are billions and billions of dollars, or whatever currency you want to use, going into how do I make the most advanced AI? How do I do that? This is going to be what everybody is changing towards. Are we going to eventually get AI and cyber joining together and eventually get mutually assured destruction on both of them? Probably. That's probably the trajectory we're ending on, right? Because everybody's going to want a piece of AI. Everybody's going to want the most advanced cyber weapons. You are going to get to that cyber or AI deterrence piece, whereas if you attack me, I'm going to make sure I wipe you out as well. It's a zero-sum game now. Same with nuclear. That's where we're heading potentially with this sort of stuff. But even inside that, we've got arms races. So we've got corporate arms races. Who's going to get the best technology for consumers to interact with us in? How are we going to design these things? We've got all these little wars going on, and they're adding up and adding up and adding up. We need to kind of get a grasp of that. Some regulatory assistance will probably help. The problem we've got with regulation is, though, it is slow, slow, slow. Okay? It's years behind where it needs to be because everything else is growing so quickly. So how we help fix that, I'm not sure. But this arms race is definitely for our generation. It's underway. I think the other thing, and everybody's kind of touched on this and kind of led into this point, is AI and our views of it and where we're developing it and what we're using it for and how we view it as an industry from a corporate perspective is it's in assist mode, okay? We are using it to do grunt work in different areas. Now, it might be highly specialised grunt work, like, highly trained SOC engineers now not having to scream through loads and loads of stuff because we're doing the AI to look for the patterns and all that sort of stuff. But it's essentially taken away this grunt work. We've also got it becoming and doing more advanced things. So if you look outside of cyber, you've got the airplane industry and military industry looking at now smart wingmen to complement the F-35 and all that sort of stuff. All of this development is around assisting us to do something. That's what we're viewing this as an industry. It's an assistant mode. So what is the business lens on this? Well, it's for massive productivity benefit, okay? I don't have to pay AI. I can run it to the bone 24/7. I am guaranteed to get exactly the same response in the scenarios that I give it all the time. AI does not have a bad day, okay? So if you're looking at this from a customer service point of view, I want to give great unified customer service experience. Loads of companies are moving towards that now. Okay, you don't interact with a human anymore, you interact through AI systems. This is where we're going from all this sort of stuff from a business point of view. You've then got two other aspects to this. You've got defense. And within cyber, we're using this to help us defend things. And actually, we've been using one form or another of AI now for at least 15 years. Okay, so my background is in Sophos Labs and things like that way back in. And we were doing all sorts of tools within our AV then at that point to do with polymorphic signature detection and things like that, okay? Now, the reason most AVs still to this day talk about signatures is because signatures are still computationally faster than doing any sort of polymorphic detection on anything. So you still want some sort of signature, but it's how you arrive at that signature. Now, part of one of the benefits that I've got in my role is I get to see all of the marketing bump from all of the vendors. And they tell me all this great stuff about what they're doing. Extrapolating that data out, there's loads of people talking to us about how you can use AI in SOC-type environments and how their product will help this and how their product will help that. Funnily enough, it takes, apparently, with most vendors, 60 days to train the AI system to be at least as good or 5% better than a human analyst in detecting threats and writing appropriate mitigations. Now, obviously, there's a lot of nuance in there. How good is the trainer? How good is the system? All that sort of stuff. But it's quite funny that all the vendors seem to hit that 60-day mark, and that's when you're good to go. So the industry is beginning to get there. You will see this industry move towards commoditization because that's what happens within cyber and all these industries is it's going to be, we're all kind of doing the same thing. We're all kind of going to give you the same outcome. Which one of us do you like best? We've got a track record of that within cyber. The other thing we've got is attack, and everybody talks about attack. Now, we've got a whole ton of problems with attack, okay? The hack back and all that sort of stuff. Attribution's the biggest thing. Who are you actually going to attack? What's the fallout going to be? Especially when you bring AI into cyber. We already see proliferation of cyber weapons, right? So you talk about WannaCry, and everybody goes, well, was it nation state? Was it this? Was it that? If you look at it, though, you've got highly, highly advanced vulnerabilities that they're exploiting, nation state level, you could say. But the world's worst written payload stuck on the top of it. if you're going to be really critical about it, right? So this is just proliferation. In cyber, this is going to be really hard to control. What do you do if you've got AI in there who's got this sort of ring-fence frame? Where does this proliferation end? How's it throw stuff over the fence? What's it going to do? In terms of attack, there's also no need for AI in cyber attack yet. Possibly a slightly controversial position. I'll back it up. We are rubbish at doing the basics as a whole. Really bad. And I've been up here talking about doing the basics for at least 12, 13 years. Same message, rinse and repeat. Like I can pick a presentation up I delivered in like 2008 and deliver it now, and it's still perfectly relevant. Images will have changed slightly, but the message is there. As a bad guy, I'm quite lazy, okay? If I want to attack people, I'm going to do it in the easiest possible way I can, because why invest all of this and develop these AI models and deep learning models if there's no need to do it? I don't think on the whole as an industry we are going to see AI attacking in systems or cyber or anything else like that until we fix the basics and we make it more difficult and we generate the need for it. So I don't think we have a fear of AI in attacks at the moment. The other thing that you use AI for in our industry is attribution. So typically how you attribute attacks to groups is in a psychological basis, right? It's how they think, it's how they write their code. That's typically how you go, well, actually, that piece of code, we know as these guys, this is very similar, all that sort of stuff. AI is very good at crunching and pattern matching. That's going to be a big area here for AI in the industry I come from. But we've got to have a bit of perspective on this. Okay, right now, we have lots of different technologies all coming together. We've got 5G coming together. We've got AI coming in. We've got new advances in cyber. We've got all the stuff that we need to be doing around trust and all that sort of stuff. Until we get some of these basics in, I don't think AI will move much beyond machine learning pattern matching in the cyber industry. That's where its value is from a commercial point of view. Academically, and all that's research-wise, it'll skyrocket. There's loads of uses for it. But at the moment, we're not ready for anything more than that. The other challenge we've got is what we call next-gen cyber-physical systems. What a terrible name, right? For those of you in the audience who are about my age, you'll remember Short Circuit, right, Johnny Five? He was a cyber-physical system, right? It's an IoT device on steroids. Now, the problem with all these devices is, as a cyber-security professional, these do not behave how I like them to behave. They are not a desktop. I cannot stick AV on them. I cannot write rules for them. I cannot stick them behind my firewall. They have no capability to install traditional security software onto them. But I need to bring them into my network because I need the productivity boost. I need the productivity gain. I need their tool set. How do I defend against them? Now, the problem we've got with AI is now going to be sitting on top of some of these devices, making them even more advanced. I can't secure the basic ones. How am I going to secure these guys? This is a massive challenge we've got as cybersecurity professionals. Our entire world's changing. We've got to rethink how we do these things. And we need lots more research here into new detection techniques, new control techniques for these sorts of devices. We've also got to get more savvy. Now, because we're business-driven, most businesses like to do things as cost-effective. I think cost-effective is the most appropriate term, right? We want to do things as cost-effectively as we possibly can, which normally means skimming some bits off and not maybe doing things. Or we're developing things where we don't have that expertise in-house, or we don't think about security and stuff like that. We still need to bring security right to the forefront of development of these devices. We are still making the same mistakes of turning out devices with security flaws that we discovered 20 years ago and fixed. But we're very good at making the same mistakes over and over and over and over again. That would be a great use of AI. Imagine if AI could come in and go, hold on guys, you've missed that bit. That would be brilliant. That's what we'd like to see. This is the challenge that we've got with this, is how do we actually implement it? What do we do? Where do we get most benefit from it for a cybersecurity world? Where is our payout? Where is the investment needed to be? And until we've figured that out, I think that will stem the growth of AI within our sector. It's going to restrict it in because we haven't got that killer case yet for it. And a lot of it is because we still aren't doing the basics right in loads of other areas. So until we've got that, you can't have anything to build on top of. And I couldn't do a presentation without, AI and cybersecurity, without Terminator in, really. Is any of this an imminent danger? Are we going to get attacked by AI? I don't think we are, right? If you look at cyber attacks to this day, they're not computer-on-computer crimes. Not one of them. At some point, there is a human involved in there, whether they socially engineer as an entry point or whether they are the victim. Okay? There's still humans in that. There's human in the loop here with everything. I don't think we're at the stage where computers are even remotely thinking about, I'm going to go and attack another computer, which is what we kind of see in all of this sort of doomsday scenario and a lot of the stuff that comes out in the press around this. Again, it comes back to the basics, as everybody keeps saying. Until we get those right, until we move on from the basics, you're not going to see any more of these advanced attacks because there's simply no need for an advanced attack in the general population. At nation-state level, that's getting more interesting. And what we are starting to see there is we are starting to see specialisations come in, as you would expect. So, you're going to have one particular team, and it's their sole purpose in life is to breach. And once they've breached, they hand it over to another specialist team, and it's their purpose in life to laterally move. And they'll hand over to another team and another team and another team. We are starting to see evidence of that sort of stuff. Maybe that's where AI will come into there and help play at that level. Who knows? Anyway, that is me, and being as I'm the last speaker, I get to put that slide up. So thank you very much, everyone. It's been a pleasure. We're around for questions.
Thank you, Andy. Really, really great. Right, so I'm going to ask the speakers to come and occupy these chairs. We've got, let's call it 20 minutes for Q&A. So grab a chair, and I hope everyone's been taking copious notes of the questions they wanted to ask for the previous talks. And the floor is open. But actually, I think I'll ask a question because there were so many questions coming up there that some really interesting questions. If Adrian and Mikko, Adrian, you made the point. Actually, we need more regulation, or we need new laws and so on. And I was wondering if everyone could have a go or had a view of if there was a new regulation that was going to help the case for cyber. What might it look like? What might it be? What might it target? Open to the panel. Adrian, do you want to have a go?
Well, I'm conscious we've got a lawyer and somebody from a telco, and I would say the telecom security bill is part of the direction of travel, at least. But that I guess is picking a particular industry that has specific challenges that have been identified by the government and putting in place regulations that are specific to that industry. Take the point, it's probably been a long way, it's been a long journey, and is it addressing the specific threats of today, and is it going to be flexible enough to address the threats tomorrow? I don't know. But it's interesting at least that we are getting into more industry-specific regulations, particularly around, and it's not just cybersecurity, but technology in general. And I think we'll probably see more of that as we get into, connected autonomous vehicles and other things.
Mikko, want to have a go at that?
Yeah, I would specify two things. So I definitely agree when it comes to the verticalization. So we need to have specific rules for specific sectors. And probably that's the better way to start rather than by just having a very general frameworks which are sector agnostics. One of these framework has been already put in place in the EU, which is the EU AI Act draft. Let's see how that goes, but many people have doubts whether that will be accepted. Although you may never underestimate the European regulators. So definitely I agree on that. But second, I think there is much more work to be done on the testing and verification practices. So some of the practices are pretty advanced in the market, and there are some good examples that could be then elevated in law. So if we could codify some of them, I think that would be highly beneficial for the whole ecosystem.
Andy?
Yeah, I was just saying, I kind of slightly disagree. I think if we're going to put verticalisation in, it needs to be framework requirements that enforce the basics. The reason for that is as soon as you start to get more advanced, it becomes very difficult to put those technical nuances into legal speak. And also that actually can hamstring some of the basics. So you'll have to forgive me because I know they've just done NIS2 and they're just about to launch that in Europe. One of the original proposals that went in there was they were going to depreciate SMS as two-factor authentication because they said it was too easy to spoof. There are some ease of spoof techniques and all that sort of stuff, but for the general population, actually, that might be a very good basic way of introducing two-factor authentication. That has now potentially just been taken off the table. So now we need a more complicated solution for people who generally aren't cyber savvy, technically astute. So we run the risk of over-regulating and making it more complicated, which then means actually we're all going to bypass it, we're all going to do something different because it makes it too difficult.
That was a nice illustration of that balance to be got. Satirius, what law would you ask for? And I'm part of what's going through my mind is actually one of the things that holds back AI in cyber is availability of relevant data and access to large quantities of data that we can then throw at the machine learning models to make them useful. But
that is a good point. Actually, it is. If I could ask for a law, I think I would ask for availability of such data, of cyber threat reports. I see that there is good reason for this being closed up because organizations are building business models around this data and this expertise that they build off this data. But I guess if we take the point from people in the industry here that the market is maturing or the industry is getting to the point of maturity where you need some regulations, I would say making this data available would be a good starting point. Then you could bring the industry together and build on top of that the added value of your service perhaps.
Thanks.
From my point of view, it is the data analytics that is missing, so that would be to take us to the next step in terms of making more out of the potential of AI in that direction, even if it is a point solution, like Adrian said. So.
And it's fair to say that some of the big advances in AI have been big AI, so the bigger models. I came across an interesting stat which I'll share with the audience. You've probably all heard of Moore's law, with the computing power doubling every 18 months. Actually, the size of computing models required for AI doubles every 3.5 months. So it's gone up by a factor of 300,000 since 2012. So that the AI is getting big and heavy, and it's starting to do things like consume carbon and so on that people are worrying about. So there's perhaps a self-limiting factor there, and as one of the things that we're looking at within the Institute is green AI, how to bring some of that back, scale that back, make it more useful. Anyway, I digress. Question from the floor. Yeah, sorry, Stuart.
Actually, it was following up on that, and on that same point about regulation, I noticed one of the things, Adrian, you mentioned there was professionalisation, and I have to say I'm sceptical about the role that professionalisation plays in cybersecurity, or probably more broadly in IT and technology. I'd say this as a chartered engineer. I think of my accountant as wanting my accountant to be chartered because I want them to be doing things by the book. I want my dentist to be doing the same thing every time and not being creative. And I do think of technology and the type of engineering that computing is as being something that does have that. Every time we're doing something, there's an element of novelty to it. And so, I watch with interest what's going on in the kind of domain of professionalisation in inverted commas of computing and acting as a member member of the BCS, but I do have a very deep vein of scepticism myself as a member and for the activities there. I wonder what Adrian, or to the panel more generally, what you were thinking that professionalisation would probably fix for us.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think one challenge that we do have in the industry is people tend to claim to be kind of a jack of all trades. So, I mean, one anecdote which I noted in the recent DCMS UK cyber sector report, fantastic analysis of the sector. They noted there was, I can't remember exactly, maybe 2,000 companies, let's say, operating in cybersecurity in the UK. And then they later on had a chart of what different companies claim they do. And half in the chart claimed that they do incident response. So I was like, how? 500 companies are claiming they do incident response in the UK. Are they all really the sort of companies that you want to get to do incident response? Or are they simply people who, you know, maybe they provide testing, maybe they provide implementation, and they think, yeah, I'll give incident response a go if it happens, because why not? We see this, you know, with companies who call their pen tester whenever they have a breach, and sometimes the pen tester is an individual or a small company, and they might do a fine job if they understand incident response, but you know, it's analogous to calling your lockpick when you've been burgled rather than calling the police or, you know, your insurance or something like that. So I think we do have a bit of a challenge in the industry of people claiming to be able to do, and it's the same in people who just do IT services in general, claiming they can do, we'll look after your security, we'll do managed security and so on. So maybe broad kind of analogies to chartered engineer isn't the right thing, but we certainly need to get better about making it clearer to buyers who is actually certified to do certain tasks in the industry.
Perhaps less about the skills of an individual, but more about, you know, if I want to go to a firm to get my boiler fixed, I want to know that, you know, the firm has got the registration to do, you know, caulking. Maybe that's also an individual thing. But I think the things that you were talking about there were more about the broad capabilities of the business and their ability to trade in and perform those activities, which goes back to your point, which I think is completely spot on around snake oil, you know, selling a thing that...
It's very hard for buyers to get a sense of is there value in this thing. You know, it sounds great. It's got a great demo. It's got some anonymous case studies, say it's great. Is it actually going to provide cybersecurity value in the long run?
I think there's kind of a challenge with the certification. I think it needs to be in highly specialised domains on an individual basis. So there's similar parallels to the intelligence world. So they are beginning to professionalise intelligence analysis and things like that. So you know the tools, you know the techniques, you have the expectations. I think for cyber, for certain areas, that's right. For other areas, it's very difficult, and it's also very difficult on a corporate or industrial scale. So if you say, hi, I'm a company and I pass this certification that says, I know exactly what I'm doing here, I'm a trusted body, that's predicated upon you having the trained individuals that are able to carry out those tasks. Let's say you certify every year. 3 months into that certification process, all of those people that your certification is predicated on leaves for a competitor. You now have that tick to say you're doing that, but you don't have the expertise or experience. So these are some of the challenges we've got if we start to introduce this blanket tick box, I'm a certified organisation to do this. I think from a customer point of view, we've got to give them the tools and the knowledge and the right questions to go out to the industry and ask. You know, these are the sorts of answers that people who know what they're talking about will give you. If they give you anything else, maybe there's some red flags there.
And I think we're just starting to see that in the AI world as well. You know, that there is absolute dearth of skills. There was an interesting report by DCMS about AI skills, which basically said that over half the people they interviewed who were AI specialists had a PhD. So the bar was very, very high. And how do you bring that down into, I want to employ a data scientist, I want to employ someone who understands current AI techniques. Actually, I then want to get into more specialist. At the moment, it's really hard to assess those kind of people knowing what you do. But is the answer more professionalisation? Probably not. Satirias, we're a talent factory for AI. How do we make sure that the people that we're churning out are actually fit for industry purpose, as it were? What are your thoughts on that?
Yes, I mean the way we try to go about it is to start from the bottom up, so to speak. So to build from the foundations of AI, to build from established computational methods, mathematical formulation of the problem, and so on. The current problem that we have in academia, at least, is that all these people are hoovered up immediately. So by the moment they graduate, they are very popular with Google DeepMind, who's in London, and so on and so forth. So we have only limited time with them, essentially. But yes, it is certainly that I agree with you that the AI is also coming to that point that needs some sort of categorization or some sort of better identification of the skill set.
And the other thing that I hear a lot in both cyber and AI is the need to inform decision makers, so senior people within organisations, as to what is cyber, what are the problems, the board level awareness, and increasingly the board level awareness for AI, because it's an opportunity. It's going to grow their top line, it's going to grow their bottom line, and so on. But there you're getting into other areas like law, which is why it's really great to have Miko and his colleagues actually starting to look at what legal frameworks and what impact it would be. How do we build those skills into board level awareness around law surrounding AI and data protection and cyber and so on?
I will answer to this question, but I would 100% agree with the previous point about the problem of retaining AI talent in academia. I think this is a highly important problem in terms of the consequences, because this is clearly a phenomenon not just at the University of Surrey, but more broadly. So I think maybe that should stimulate us to think critically how the university should be organized when it comes to talent retention in that area. That may potentially expand to other areas too, in terms of the commercial motivations, but also in terms of the technology transfer that is being done from the university to the business. I think currently we are quite weak in that, in terms of what are the specific rules. The rules are not great incentives for AI entrepreneurs to establish the company with IP from the university. I can expand this point if anyone might be interested, but I think there is lots of room for improvement here. Then I think on your question, Andrew, so there are some very specific problems, legal problems for AI companies, which I believe is a great start for the deeper engagement. But the bottom line is to trying to get the sense of what these problems are and what will be the role of lawyers to address this problem. So just to give you an example, there is a company in the US which is trying to, a small stage company but growing, is trying to build a Bloomberg for medical data. And then they are getting the whole business models based on the fact that they are getting data from hospitals in the US and Europe, organizing this data, labeling them, and then as commercializing data for AI companies working on the specific data sets. Of course, the companies do not have access to these data sets, so the company, by building the repository, is able to do interesting business by commercializing that data. Then in the US, they don't have any problems when it comes to getting data from hospitals. In Europe, they haven't been able to partner with any hospitals. Not because there is a clear provision which says you're not allowed to do so, but because we have GDPR in Europe, and according to one of the dominant interpretation of GDPR, even though you are using highly advanced privacy-preserving technologies, you are unable to get that data from hospital. So then I think that might be a way for lawyers to be involved in these companies, by essentially serving as advisors how to navigate the current and the potential future ecosystem, purely from the legal standpoint, but second, from the AI ethics. So then, okay, if you are getting this data from hospitals in Europe, how you are going to ensure that this data will be then ethically repurposed for the private business purposes. So I think this is here where I think lawyers could play an important role in AI and cyber, and they could be even elevated in the company as really key people in terms of how their work could influence the business outcome.
Yeah, thank you. Let's have another question from the floor.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, Adrian's point about impact is absolutely brilliant. We don't look at impact, and if we don't understand impact, we don't understand business risk. I'm looking at internationally what's happening, and actually there is a country that's probably demonstrating where cyber's going to go. It's not Ukraine, it's Costa Rica. Going back to the point about regulation, the issue with all of this is about culture. The problem I just would like to ask is there's an issue about regulation and what impact it has on how people see security, and whether it brings the bar down so far that they only pay lip service to it. So how do we not just regulate, but change the mindset of organisations so they get the right culture and the right appreciation of risk? Because otherwise, regulation actually is fairly worthless.
Interesting.
Was that at me?
Well,
So,
You go first.
okay, so look, whenever you go into the commercial world, right, what are the levers for commercial competition? So you make having the highest security standards commercially advantageous, i.e., if you take the best care, you've got all these security bits and pieces in place, that is a selling point for your business to your customer. That's one way you do it. The challenge you've got is that you're always going to get breached, so then you immediately devalue that brand that you've just built when the inevitable happens and you are breached. I think we've got a bit of a shame and hiding culture because of that. And it's kind of, in some ways, from a commercial perspective, it's a challenge, because if you come out and say you've lost all this data, that has an impact on your bottom line potentially, because for a short period of time you'll lose customers, you'll lose revenue, etc., etc. If you're a large organisation, you can kind of take the hit, bounce back up, talk, Sony, etc. If you're a mid-market or small organisation, gone. You can't avoid that. You can't afford that disruption to your cash flow on a monthly basis. So if you lose customers for 6 months, that might be the difference between you surviving or not. But I think there's a shame element in here that we've got to normalise. I know it sounds an horrific thing for a security person to say, but we have to normalise being breached. We have to normalise this within society to say, look, this is going to happen. You buy insurance, the car insurance, right? Because there's an inevitability that at some point you'll have an accident. They've changed life insurance now as a term to life assurance, because we all will die. It's that same type of thinking that we've got to bring into cybersecurity and just acknowledge where we are in the world. Yes, there is going to be a breach. Yes, organisations are vulnerable. Where the shame factor needs to come in is if they haven't done anything, if they genuinely have not taken steps to mitigate it against it. Apply a bit of shame factor, because that will increase people's standards anyway. Otherwise, go, look, you did everything you could do. These things happen. I think we've got to get to that rational point with some of this sort of stuff.
So can I just say, sorry to jump into you, Adrian, but on the same factor, I go back to the data availability also. That's also one of the reasons that there's no data on the detail of the attack and how it evolved, because organizations feel they'll pay the hit themselves when they release that data.
And also because it takes them a long time to fix things, actually. Sure. So if the data comes out before they fixed it, everybody piles in. And we're starting to see that with lots of other attacks that have gone on. It's found other vulnerabilities, and everybody's piling into those organisations, and there's one breach after another coming out because the focus is on them. That's the other problem with data sharing that you've got.
Yeah, and I guess just to kind of follow on the challenge around data, I mean, the most interesting attacks, when they get discovered by organisations, they'll be put under legal privilege very quickly. And once they're put under legal privilege, it completely stops ability to share that, and it's very rare that then gets into the public domain. But I was looking into some data on impacts. We got access, we did a trial of a tool that helps with cyber risk quantification. And like I said, threat side of things, fine. Vulnerability side of things, fine. You can see how that. But the impact side of things was all based on a library of attacks that had happened where the impacts were known. It was kind of broken down for different industries and so on to give other people a way to kind of model that for their particular organization. But when you kind of drilled into it, all the impacts were legal costs. It was all fines, or it was all the class action lawsuits. It was all heavily skewed by the US, because in the US, all the kind of legal risk is massive, which is why all of the ransomware attacks are focused on the US, because the attackers have realized that the US will pay out because their lawyers are recommending, well, just pay it, because the cost from a legal risk perspective is astronomical. So, yeah, it's definitely a problem. We don't have a good way to model impact reliably at the moment. The stuff that is out there is heavily biased. There are other approaches that industries have taken, for example, around earthquakes. I can't remember exactly the name, but there's an analogous scale to the Richter scale for earthquake damage, but it gives you more of this is the impact from different types of scenarios. And we need something like that, I think, for cyber.
If I may comment, I fully agree that one can build regulations on culture, and probably that's the reasonable approach. I think in the international law, when we think about the weapons review procedure, it actually has started way before it has been codified by the Geneva Convention. It has started as a essentially internal practice of some of the states. For instance, the US government is conducting US internal weapons review way before it has been, the Geneva Convention has been agreed upon, and the US, by the way, is not the part of it. But then why we can't potentially apply that to AI models, and instead of weapons, so maybe in addition to weapons review, have AI models review procedure, which could be then open sourced, shared, and discussed internationally. And maybe if there will be a critical community of people and users interested in that, we can then build on the certain normative stream out of it. I think this might be a way to go. And one more thing in terms of the culture is, of course, many of the organizations, the countries or private companies, claim that they have certain ethical principles which guide their work. For instance, that the AI should be transparent or explainable and so forth. I think it would be good to better understand, and I think researchers could play a great role in that, to what extent actually these principles are operationalized in those organizations. There is a phenomenal research being done by John Grant from Palantir, who actually took some of the big technology companies and checked their principles, how they recruit talents, and to what extent then these principles are actually experienced by the professionals who have been recruited by those companies. And they have come up that there is a huge discrepancy in the big technology companies in terms of what sort of values they claim to adhere to, and then what sort of values are indeed experienced by the professionals working for those companies.
Thank you. And there's perhaps some interesting analogies with the obligations on climate change reporting that's come into the PLC world from January 21, the big listed companies, and we're going to start seeing those kind of reports about preparedness, transition, and so on, and perhaps that sort of shaming factor, that culture factor, can be more widely applied. I'm conscious of time. It's 6:10. We were supposed to finish at 6, so apologies for overrunning. I'm afraid I'll curtail the questions. So if you have questions, please, hopefully the panel will stay around afterwards. There's refreshments outside. So thank you very much for turning up today, for being in a reel. And thank you to the organisers, to Jason and others who've made this possible, to the SASIG for enabling our event. We will be doing another of these events probably just after the summer, September. We haven't quite finalised the topic yet. We've had a succession of really interesting, engaging subjects, and I hope you found today interesting. So I'd like to say thanks to the panel, and thank you to the audience. See you outside.